In academia, they teach you that the person who controls the primary sources controls the narrative. My supervising professor took my research, my book, and my future, but he made one fatal mistake. He forgot that I still had the receipts, and they were all perfectly time-stamped. My world used to be made of dust. Not the boring kind that settles on neglected furniture, but the rich, fragrant dust of history that lived in the university's special collections archive. It smelled of decaying paper, leather, and time itself. For 5 years, that basement library was my sanctuary. I was Evelyn, and I was on the verge of completing my PhD in history, a journey that had consumed every waking moment of my late 20s. My dissertation wasn't just a requirement, it was my life's passion. I had unearthed a figure so deep in the footnotes of the past, she had been practically invisible, a 17th century female cartographer named Isabel Vane, who had anonymously mapped trade routes under a male pseudonym. I found her by accident through a cryptic reference in a ship's log I was digitizing for a side project. That single mention sent me down a rabbit hole that became my obsession. I spent years chasing whispers of her existence across Europe, hunched over brittle letters and forgotten archives in Lisbon, deciphering coded astronomical charts in a dusty corner of the Bodleian Library, and cross-referencing shipping manifests with personal diaries. I was methodical, obsessive even. I built a digital database from scratch, photographing and transcribing every single document, every faded ink stroke. Each file was a breadcrumb, and I was slowly, painstakingly, resurrecting a ghost. My advisor, Professor James Croft, was a giant in our field. He was in his 50s, with that easy, tweet-glad charm that donors and undergraduates alike found irresistible. His books were bestsellers, the kind that made history accessible and exciting, and his lectures were legendary. When he agreed to supervise my thesis, I felt like I'd won the lottery. He was encouraging, almost paternal, always eager to hear about my latest breakthrough. "Evelyn, this is groundbreaking," he'd say, his eyes gleaming with intellectual excitement as I showed him a newly translated letter. "You're not just writing a thesis, you're rewriting a piece of the historical map. Isabel Vanchy's your discovery. Yours." I trusted him implicitly. I shared everything, my database, my transcriptions, my half-formed theories scribbled in the margins of notebooks. I uploaded my sources to a shared university server he had access to, so he could review my progress. He was my mentor, the gatekeeper to the academic world I so desperately wanted to join. Looking back, the red flags were there, subtle as a watermark on aged paper. The way his questions became less about my interpretation and more about the raw data. "The casual send me that file, will you?" That became a constant refrain. I was a naive PhD candidate, eager to please, and I mistook his intense interest for scholarly guidance. He was a narcissist hiding in plain sight, and I was feeding his ego with my life's work. The betrayal came not with a bang, but with a glossy, full-page ad in the New York Review of Books. It was a Tuesday morning. I was in my shared office, wrestling with a particularly difficult chapter on Vane's coded correspondence, when my office mate, Liam, slid the journal across my desk. "Hey, look, it's Croft. Another bestseller, I bet." I glanced down, and the world tilted on its axis. The title of the book was The Shadow Navigator. The author was, of course, Professor James Croft. But it was the subtitle that hollowed me out: The Lost Maps and Secret Life of Isabel Vane. My blood ran cold. I snatched the journal, my fingers trembling. The summary was a sickening echo of my own prospectus, using phrases and arguments I had tearfully hammered out in my own research proposal 2 years prior. It described a maverick 17th century cartographer, a woman hidden behind a male pseudonym, groundbreaking analysis of previously unseen primary sources. My sources. My woman. My life. I stumbled out of the office and ran to the campus bookstore. There it was, stacked in a proud pyramid by the entrance. His smiling, handsome face beamed from the back cover. I flipped through the pages, a wave of nausea washing over me. It was all there. My research, my structure, my painstakingly translated letters. He hadn't even bothered to change much, just polished my academic prose into his signature, pop history style. The acknowledgments section was a final, brutal slap in the face. He thanked the diligent archivists and librarians and even the promising graduate students in the department for their stimulating discussions. My name was nowhere to be found. For a week, I was a ghost. I didn't eat. I didn't sleep. My career was over before it had even begun. He hadn't just stolen my research, he had salted the earth. Any attempt I made to publish my own work now would be seen as a pathetic, delusional act of plagiarism against a celebrated historian. He had my entire digital database, every piece of evidence I had ever collected. Who would believe a hysterical, unknown PhD candidate over the charming, respected Professor James Croft? The university would protect its star asset, not a disposable grad student. He had the power, the reputation, and the entire academic establishment on his side. He had won. The shock slowly curdled into something else, something cold and hard and clear. It settled deep in my bones, a chilling, methodical rage. He thought he had taken everything. He thought he controlled the narrative. But he had forgotten one crucial thing. I was the archivist. I knew the provenance of every single document. And in my personal, offline backup, my secret, obsessive, triple redundant backup, I still had the receipts. And they were all perfectly, beautifully time-stamped. The first few weeks after the discovery were a blur of impotent fury and suffocating despair. I'd walk past posters on campus advertising his upcoming book tour and feel a fresh wave of sickness. His face was everywhere, smiling that smug, intellectual smile. He was being interviewed on NPR, lauded in literary magazines, and celebrated by the very institution that I had once revered. I was invisible, a footnote in my own story, and he was the celebrated author. My friends, the few I had outside the history department, were sympathetic but helpless. You have to report him. They'd insist. Go to the dean. Go to the ethics committee. They didn't understand. Academia isn't a courtroom with a presumption of innocence. It's a kingdom, and James Croft was a lord of the realm. A formal accusation would be my word against his. He would claim he guided me to the sources, that the theories were his all along, that my work was merely a student's execution of a professor's grand vision. The university would launch a quiet, internal investigation designed to protect its reputation. They would bury it, and in the process, they would bury me. I'd be labeled as unstable, vindictive, a disgruntled student. I wouldn't just lose the fight, I would be professionally excommunicated. No, a direct confrontation was a battle I was guaranteed to lose. I knew I couldn't fight him on his terms. I had to fight him on mine. As a historian, the core principle of our discipline is proof. Evidence. Primary sources. He had used my evidence to build his lie, so I would use that same evidence to dismantle it, piece by agonizing piece. My revenge wouldn't be a shouted accusation, it would be a quiet, irrefutable, and publicly accessible archive of the truth. The plan began to form in the dark, early hours of the morning, fueled by cheap coffee and a burning sense of injustice. I bought a new laptop, paying in cash. I started using a VPN and encrypted browsers, becoming a ghost in the machine. I wasn't just a historian anymore, I was learning to be a digital insurgent. My obsessive archival nature was now my greatest weapon. For years, I had maintained a meticulous personal server with backups of every document I had ever found, every photograph I had ever taken, every email I had ever exchanged with Croft. Each file had its original metadata intact, showing the exact date and time it was created or received. My digital trail was a perfect, chronological record of my research journey, starting years before his book was even a glimmer in his thieving eyes. I decided to build an open-source, anonymous digital archive. I registered a nondescript domain name, vanesource.org, and began to build the website from the ground up. It was stark, academic, and professional. No flashy graphics, no emotional appeals. Just the cold, hard facts. The homepage simply read, an open source archive of primary documents pertaining to the life and work of Isabel Vane. The process was painstaking and methodical. It was my dissertation all over again, but this time the stakes were my sanity. I started uploading the documents chronologically, mirroring the timeline of my own discovery. First, the ship's log from 2019 with its cryptic reference to Vane. The metadata clearly showed the file was created on my university-issued research scanner nearly 6 years ago. Then the first batch of letters from the Lisbon archive, dated and time-stamped a few months later. I cross-referenced each document with my email correspondence with Croft. October 17, 2020, email from me to Professor Croft. Subject, Breakthrough. Attachment, Vane Letter Lisbon 01.pdf. Body, Professor, you won't believe what I found. This seems to be a letter from Vane to her brother. I uploaded the email as a separate entry in the archive, a digital breadcrumb for anyone who cared to follow the trail. I did this for every single one of the 247 primary sources that formed the backbone of his book. Each document was paired with a timestamped file from my personal server and the corresponding email showing me sending it to him, often with my own initial analysis. The archive was becoming a silent, damning timeline of his theft. The work was grueling. I barely left my small apartment, the blinds drawn, my world shrinking to the glow of the screen. I saw him on a morning talk show once, a clip a friend sent me. He was charming, of course, talking about the thrill of the historical chase and the years of painstaking work that went into the Shadow Navigator. It was a lonely process, he said, shaking his head with a theatrical sigh. Just me and the documents, piecing together Isabel's incredible story. I almost threw my coffee mug through my monitor. My lowest point came about 2 months into the project. His book hit the New York Times bestseller list. The university threw a lavish party in his honor. From my apartment window, I could see the lights of the faculty club, hear the faint sounds of celebration. I was eating instant noodles and uploading the 17th century property deed while the man who ruined my life was being toasted with champagne. Doubt began to creep in. Was this all for nothing? Would anyone ever even find this obscure website? Was I just screaming into the void? I was so close to giving up, to just deleting everything and trying to salvage some kind of life away from the wreckage of my academic dreams. That night, drowning in cheap wine and self-pity, I was scrolling through my old research files, ready to just burn it all. And then I saw it. A folder I had labeled unverified. It contained a handful of documents I had never shared with Croft, things I had set aside because they didn't quite fit my initial thesis or required further authentication. And in that folder was one particular file, vanefinalletter.pdf. My heart stopped. It was the last letter I had found, just a few months before he stole my work. A letter that I had never sent him. A letter that not only proved his plagiarism but would expose a far greater academic sin. The letter was my ace in the hole. I had found it tucked away in a miscatalogued collection of family papers at a small, private auction in the UK, just before the world turned upside down. It was a final, heartbreaking letter from Isabel Vane to her brother, written just weeks before her death. I hadn't shared it with Croft for a simple reason: it contradicted my, and therefore his, entire thesis. The central, blockbuster argument of the Shadow Navigator was that Isabel Vane, working in secret, had single-handedly and accurately mapped a previously unknown, lucrative trade route to the East Indies, a discovery that made her male patron immensely wealthy. It was a triumphant, proto-feminist narrative of a forgotten genius finally getting her due, which, of course, was what made the book so commercially successful. Croft had taken my research and spun it into a Hollywood-ready tale. But this final letter told a different, more complicated story. In it, a dying Isabel confessed to her brother that her final set of maps, the very ones Croft's entire book was centered around, were based on speculation. She had been pressured by her patron to produce a route, and with her health failing, she had combined incomplete data with educated guesses and outright fabrications. She was terrified that ships would be sent using her faulty charts and prayed they would never be used. I have built a castle of ink on a sea of lies, she wrote, her handwriting shaky and frail. The blockbuster conclusion of his book wasn't just plagiarized, it was a complete fabrication. He had built his triumphant narrative on a foundation he knew to be false, or at the very least, had ignored any evidence to the contrary. But he didn't have this final letter. He couldn't have it. I was the only person in the world who knew it existed. This document didn't just prove he was a thief, it proved he was a fraud. It would utterly destroy his credibility as a historian. To knowingly publish a false conclusion is the ultimate academic sin. Holding this knowledge felt like holding a live wire. The temptation to release it immediately was immense. I could have sent it to a journalist, to the university board, and blown the whole thing up right then and there. But I knew that would be a mistake. A single document, released prematurely, could be dismissed. He could claim it was a forgery, a desperate act from a troubled student. No, my revenge had to be as methodical and evidence-based as the research he'd stolen. I had to build the foundation of proof so solidly that when I finally placed this capstone, the entire structure of his career would collapse under its weight. So I held back. I continued my work on vainsource.org with a renewed, almost terrifying sense of purpose. I uploaded every other document, every email, every piece of metadata. The archive grew, a silent, ticking time bomb in a quiet corner of the internet. I created a few anonymous accounts on history forums and academic social media platforms. I didn't push it hard, just a few subtle posts. Has anyone seen this new Isabel Vane archive? An incredible resource. Interesting primary source collection on 17th century cartography here. Slowly, organically, people started to find it. At first, it was just a few clicks a day, then dozens, then hundreds. I saw it being linked in university library guides, mentioned in niche history blogs. Graduate students were citing it in their own research. The website was becoming a recognized academic resource, its legitimacy built on the sheer, undeniable weight of the evidence it presented. No one knew who had built it, but they knew it was real. All the while, Croft's star continued to rise. He was shortlisted for the prestigious Kundal History Prize. The movie rights for The Shadow Navigator were sold. He was the toast of the academic world, the charming public intellectual who had brought a forgotten female hero to life. And with every interview he gave, every award he accepted, he dug his own grave a little deeper. He was cementing the fraudulent version of history into the public consciousness, making his eventual fall from grace all the more spectacular. My life had become a strange duality. By day, I worked a mindless data entry job to pay the rent, a ghost of my former academic self. By night, I was the anonymous, avenging archivist, meticulously sharpening the blade for the final stroke. I watched him, I studied him, I waited for the perfect moment. The announcement came in early spring. Professor James Croft was being honored at the university's annual Founders Gala. It was the biggest event of the academic year, a black tie affair attended by the university president, major donors, and national media. He was to be the keynote speaker, celebrating the phenomenal success of his book. The university was even dedicating a new wing of the history department in his name. It was the apex of his triumph, the absolute peak of his career. And that's when I knew it couldn't be more perfect. The night of the gala was cold and clear. I wasn't there, of course. I was in my small, dark apartment miles away, with my new laptop open on the kitchen table. I had a live stream of the event playing on my second monitor. I saw him walk onto the stage to thunderous applause, looking handsome and confident in his tuxedo. He placed his hands on the lectern, a humble smile playing on his lips, and began his speech. History, he began, his famous, resonant voice filling the grand hall, is about finding the truth. It is about giving a voice to the voiceless. And tonight, I want to talk about the voice of a woman named Isabel Vane. My heart was pounding in my chest. I had the final post for vanesource.org queued up. It contained a high-resolution scan of Isabel's final, damning letter. The title of the post was simple: A Final Confession, the Vane Letter, c. 1682. I had also drafted a short, anonymous email with the subject line an urgent addendum to the historical record regarding Professor Croft's The Shadow Navigator. The body of the email contained only a link to that specific new post on the archive. The recipient list was a thing of beauty: the history departments of every Ivy League and Russell Group university, the editors of every major historical journal, the producers of every news outlet that had interviewed him, and, for good measure, the entire staff directory of our own university, from the president down to the janitorial staff. I watched him on the screen, soaking in the adoration of the crowd. My finger hovered over the send button. My whole life, my entire future, had been reduced to this single, quiet click. He was in the middle of a particularly flowery passage about Isabel Vane's unwavering courage and unimpeachable integrity when I clicked send. For a moment, nothing happened. The world didn't stop. The live stream continued, showing Croft gesturing passionately, the audience rapt. My apartment was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the frantic thumping of my own heart. I felt a sudden, terrifying pang of anticlimax. Had I made a huge mistake? Then, my second monitor, which I had opened to a social media feed tracking keywords like James Croft and Isabel Vane, flickered. One post. A graduate student in a different time zone. Whoa. Has anyone seen this new letter on the Vane Source site? This changes everything. Then another. And another. A journalist from a national newspaper tweeted, checking on a major developing story in the academic world. Source claims blockbuster history book The Shadow Navigator is based on a fraudulent premise. Link here. He had linked directly to the letter. On the live stream, the first signs of trouble were subtle. A few people in the audience, sitting at the back, looked down at their phones, their faces illuminated by the pale blue light. A man in the front row, one of the university's biggest donors, nudged his wife and showed her his screen. Her polite smile vanished. Murmurs began to ripple through the grand hall, a low buzz that slowly grew in volume. Croft, insulated in the bubble of the stage lights and his own ego, didn't seem to notice at first. He forged ahead with his speech, but the energy in the room had shifted. The adoring silence was replaced by a confused, restless whispering. He faltered, losing his place for a second, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. The university president, sitting at the head table, was handed a phone by a frantic-looking aide. I watched in glorious high definition as his face went from celebratory to confused to utterly horrified in the space of about 10 seconds. He looked up at Croft on the stage, his expression one of pure, unadulterated panic. That's when Croft knew something was wrong. He could feel it. The whispers were now a low roar. People weren't looking at him anymore, they were looking at their phones, turning to their neighbors, their faces a mixture of shock and outrage. His voice, once so commanding, was now just a tinny sound lost in the rising tide of his own undoing. He stopped, mid-sentence. Is everything all right? He asked, a nervous tremor in his voice. No one answered. The sound of 100 phone notifications pinging at once filled the sudden, awkward silence. His career was evaporating in real time, in a symphony of synchronized digital alerts. His public triumph had turned into a public execution. I closed my laptop. I didn't need to see the rest. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic. It was a bigger story than I could have ever imagined. The combination of the meticulous, timestamped evidence of plagiarism on vainsource.org, capped by the bombshell letter proving deliberate academic fraud, was irrefutable. It wasn't just an academic scandal, it was a story of deception, hubris, and a spectacular fall from grace. It had everything. The university, desperate to contain the damage, suspended him the next morning. An external investigation was launched, which, using my perfectly organized archive as its roadmap, confirmed everything in a matter of weeks. The Kundal Prize nomination was rescinded. His publisher pulped every copy of The Shadow Navigator and issued a public apology. The movie deal vanished. The new wing of the history department was quietly postponed. James Croft, the celebrated historian, became a pariah overnight. He was stripped of his tenure and resigned in disgrace. I never saw him again. The creator of vainsource.org remained anonymous. There were theories, of course. Many suspected a rival academic or a digital vigilante. Some in the department looked at me with a newfound, slightly fearful respect, but no one ever asked me directly. They didn't need to. My silence was its own answer. The university, in a quiet act of penance, offered me a deal. They would quietly reinstate me, fund the remainder of my PhD, and offer me a postdoctoral fellowship upon completion. I thought about it for a long time. It was everything I had ever wanted. But looking at the offer, all I could feel was the dust of those archives, the scent of decay. The passion I once had was gone, burned away by the acid of betrayal and the cold fire of revenge. The fight had changed me. I declined their offer. I took my dissertation, The Real Story of Isabel Vane, a brilliant, complicated woman who had been failed by history and then exploited by a man, and I published it myself, online, for free, linking it to the Vane source archive. It was for anyone and everyone. History, I had decided, shouldn't belong to the hallowed halls of an institution that valued its reputation more than the truth. It belonged to everyone. My revenge was complete. It was more total than I had ever dared to imagine. But as I walked away from the university for the last time, I didn't feel the pure, triumphant elation I had expected. I just felt quiet. I had reclaimed my narrative, I had exposed a fraud, and I had served a cold, delicious dish of justice. But I had also learned that sometimes, when you burn down the world of the person who wronged you, you have to find the courage to walk away from the ashes and build a new world of your own. And for the first time in a very long time, I was finally ready to do that. Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe and give this video a like. We appreciate everyone and can't wait to bring more stories your way.